Hello, welcome to our podcast. I'm Tim Ingram, here with my wife Ingrid, and we are missionaries to Brazil. And this is our podcast for wise women. How are you doing today?
Doing good, and you?
Doing wonderful. Had a great couple weeks. We've missed a week, but we are back and excited to be here. And we are going to be talking about Esther today, studying her life and finding wisdom in her life. And we find a lot of things that are just so powerful in her life. Today we'll be going through chapter 1 and chapter 2. In our Portuguese podcast, we did 2 episodes, but in English we're just going to do 1 and try and cover these 2 chapters. And so let's go ahead and get started here in Esther chapter 1. We should read a little bit here. Why don't you read for us verse 1 through maybe verse 5 to get us started.
Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus. My problem is the Portuguese messing with me. Ahasuerus, which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia over 127 provinces. That in those days when the king Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the palace, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast unto all his princes and his servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of the provinces being before him. When he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even 180 days. And when these days were expired, the king made a feast unto all the people that were present in Shushan the palace, both unto great and small, 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace, where were white, green, and blue hangings, fastened with cords of fine linen, and purple to silver rings, and pillars of marble, and the beds were of gold and silver upon a pavement of red, and blue and white, and black marble.
Okay. And so Ahasuerus was his title. Probably this was King Xerxes. From history, won't go into that too much, but he reigned, had a huge kingdom. He's going to make a feast here, and verse 9, it says, Vashti the queen made a feast for the women in the royal house, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. And so, I don't know, I think you've got some notes on this that we did about this feast, about these 2 feasts, really.
Well, first of all, just imagine a feast going on for basically 6 months.
Yeah.
It's quite the show. He's showing off the size of his kingdom, the riches of his kingdom, the power that he has, the influence that he has, and all of that. And probably it was just cultural that the men would party separate from the women, would feast and celebrate separately. So
it is of note that the king did choose to separate the 2 feasts, because this will come and play in the next part. But for those who are listening to remember, these were pagan people. This was a pagan kingdom, pagan king, pagan queen. So this first chapter, they're lost people. They're pagan. And really in this first chapter is not really a lot of spiritual lessons because everybody's lost.
It's just the backdrop to the story.
Yeah, it's just the backdrop to the story. And in Esther, what we see is the providence of God working, and in this situation, God's going to use Esther to save his people, which is an incredible story. But we see a lot of things. We're going to see in chapter 2 some things that aren't right, that some decisions were made by the people of God, by, I'm trying to think of his name in English. Mordecai, and, that weren't right, but God's going to work in spite of that. And so one of the things we see in Esther, a lot of times we say, well, I made a bad decision here, a bad decision there. And we see that God can still, work in that.
All right. Not a license to make bad decisions, but that God is powerful enough to work in spite of our bad decisions.
Yeah, and I don't think we should expect God to work in spite of our bad decisions. We need to follow God in our decisions and honor Him. But we do see that God is powerful enough to override our bad decisions, and we'll see that more in chapter 2. So the party went on for 6 months. For the men and for the women. And this, let's go on to the second part here, chapter 2, where the king's going to call Vashti. I'll read verse 10. It says, on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mahumim, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king, to bring Vashti the queen before the king with the royal crown, to show the people and her princess her beauty, for she was fair to look upon. And you imagine that she was beautiful. I mean, the king could have anybody he wanted, so she's a beautiful wife. And the king was drunk. His heart was merry with wine because he was drunk, and he sent for Vashti to come to him. And you think he wouldn't have done this if he wasn't drunk, because there was a reason he separated the men and the women.
But he'd also been for 6 months showing off all the great things that he had in his kingdom. And this was the one thing he hadn't shown off yet.
Yeah, and so he was pretty proud of her. He was like, I'm going to show off my wife. And the question is, was he right or wrong to do this? And the answer is, since he probably wouldn't have done this if he wasn't drunk, it probably was not a wise decision for him to call her to come in where all the men are, where he'd separate them. So it probably was not a wise decision on his part. But again, he's lost, he's drunk. So,
some would say, well, as the king, he had the right to do that. And that's true.
That's true.
It doesn't mean it was wise.
It doesn't mean it was wise. But as the king, he did have the right. He could have people killed if he wanted to. He could do whatever he wanted because as a pagan lost king, he was lost. But it probably wasn't a wise decision for him to do that. In verse 12, read verse 12 for us there.
But the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned in him.
Okay, so she didn't come.
She was probably upset and ashamed.
Okay, was she wrong to not come?
Well, that is a great question, because it could be debated that since it was unwise of him to call her, and it would be an embarrassment to her, that she maybe had the right. But being the wife and him as the king, not just the husband, but the king, wow. Sometimes we women have to do things, we have to do things we don't want to do in order to obey the Lord.
Yeah. And, they're lost, but I think it's clear that she was wrong because he is the king. And as the king, he makes the rules. Even if he makes a bad decision, she still has to obey, even if she didn't like it, even if she didn't think it was a good decision, even if she's probably sitting there thinking, but he made separate feasts for this reason. But whatever her excuse was, whatever her reason was, justification.
She might have even been fearful, a whole bunch of drunk men.
Yeah, maybe. But in the end, technically, she was still wrong.
She was wrong.
She was wrong. And, that's a lot of times where women are like, well, what do I do? And in 1 Peter, he says that for the wife who's got a husband who doesn't obey the word, and that can be a husband that's saved and doesn't obey the word, or a husband that's lost. He says to submit yourself to them. In Romans chapter 13 as well, talks about submission. So she was wrong not to come. And so if people want to justify that, he was the king. They're pagans. They're lost. But the king's order, as the king, he could have had her killed for not coming. A lot of things he could have done. The laws of the Medes and the Persian, they did have laws. But this is an interesting point because they didn't have a law about this.
Right.
And so there wasn't a law that said what he should do. And that's the interesting thing, because the king immediately, when she doesn't come, he's like, what do we do? Because he doesn't...
Yeah, he wasn't reactionary as in off with her head kind of reactionary like we would see in medieval Europe or something. But
so the Medes and the Persians did not have a law about what would happen if the queen didn't obey. And that's interesting. There was no law. And so, when we ask was she right or wrong, well, we see here there wasn't a law. So she could have been like, well, there's no law that says I have to come. I don't know, what the setup here was.
It is interesting, the king, that it says it was his manner to consult the wise men.
Mm-hmm. And so Ahasuerus here is going to consult the wise men about what he should do.
In verse 15,
Yeah.
He asks, "What shall we do unto the queen Vashti according to law? Because she hath not performed the commandment of the king Ahasuerus by the chamberlains."
Mm-hmm.
And here we go. Memucan's gonna.
He's gonna come up with a plan here,
He's got an answer ready.
and somebody said that he's a milquetoast guy here. He's like, well, my wife doesn't obey me either, so let's make a law. And so verse
16.
Yeah, verse 16, the queen hath not done wrong to the king only, but also to the princes and the people that are in the province of the king Ahasuerus. For the deed of the queen shall come abroad unto all women, so that they shall despise their husband in their eyes, which shall be reported. And it is true that she was a bad example to all the women to not obey the king. It was going to be heard. But the thing here is they're going to make an example out of her in a moment of wrath and anger. And I'm pretty sure, and drunkenness, and I'm pretty sure the king is going to regret this decision. I think we see that in chapter 2, that when you make a decision in emotion and you're rash, that many times, most of the time, when you make a decision in emotion, it's not the best decision. And so the men are here, they're all like, oh, let's kick her out, and they're all excited, they're all pumped, they're all like, oh, let's make an example out of her. But the one who's going to suffer here is the king. Because they're not like, it's not their wives, it's his wife. And so a lot of times people, in emotion, like a marriage, they come in and they're like, oh, in emotion, they're like, oh, let's break up this marriage, let's divorce. But divorce isn't God's plan. I mean, God only permitted divorce because of the hardness of our hearts. That's what Jesus said. And so a lot of times people in haste and emotion, they make a decision that's not God's will. Now, we believe that God can save every marriage. We believe that marriages can be saved. We work for that. And so for the women who are listening, I just want to tell you that, God is working and God is helping. And if we'll submit to God, God can restore a marriage. God can work in a marriage. God can work in your life. And we're going to see, because this book is about the providence of God, how God blesses Esther and Mordecai. So they made a decree in verse 19, let there go a royal commandment from him, and the laws of the Medes and Persians can't be altered. And that's what it says. And let it be written among the laws of the Persians and Medes that it not be altered. And the laws of the Medes and Persians couldn't be altered, not even by the king. That Vashti come no more before the king Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than he. Now they could have had her killed. I mean, it was within their purview to have the queen killed.
They could have done any number of things.
But it was
just removing her from her position and his presence.
Yeah, and so it could have been much more harsh than this. And saying, please the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. He sent letters unto all province, and every province according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, that every man should bear rule in his own house, and that it should be published according to the language of every people. And of course, that's biblical, Kim, that a man's, he rules his own house. The man is the head of the household. So this first chapter is kind of just setting the stage for the rest of the book. So do you have any more thoughts there on chapter 1?
Just that it's never right to do wrong, even if we have a reason, and there's a consequence to our actions.
Yeah.
His consequence is that he put his wife in a bad position that's going to result in a decision that maybe he's not going to be real thrilled about later on.
Yeah.
Her consequence in disobeying and not coming is that she's going to lose her position as queen. Mm-hmm. And that in and of itself is a shame. Yeah.
Which is interesting, because in chapter 1, we see that there was some bad decisions made. The king calling for her was unwise. Her not coming was disobedience, and then she's removed. But it's interesting because God's going to use all of that later on in the book. So chapter 2, verse 1, it says, after these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. So I think he's a bit sad that now after the anger is worn off and he's sobered up, he is regretting what he'd done. To me, that's my thought, that he made a decision in haste, and now he can't go back because the laws of the Medes and Persians can't be changed. So they're going to get a plan here. Why don't you read for us there in verse 2 through verse 4.
Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, let there be fair young virgins sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins unto Shushan the palace, to the house of the women unto the custody of Hegi, the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women, and let their things for purification be given them, and let the maiden which pleaseth the king be queen instead of Vashti, and the thing pleased the king, and he did so.
Okay, so they're going to gather together all the fair virgins into Shushan the palace. Now this is interesting because the question comes, was this women who wanted to come or women who were just plucked out and chosen to be like, you're pretty, you're pretty, you're pretty, you're pretty. And so they're going to all...
Probably a combination. I'm sure there were some dads that were like, you're young, you could be the queen. Go.
Yeah,
but I think there are also, I mean, he sent people out to gather these women. So like, I can imagine also that it was like, oh, hey, you might please the king. Let's come in with us. It's hard to know for sure. The Bible doesn't say, but knowing how things tended to work in that time.
Yeah, it says in verse 8, it says, so it came to pass when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together into Shushan the palace to the custody of Haggai, that Esther was brought into the king's house to the custody of Haggai, keeper of the women. So it doesn't specifically say whether Mordecai offered her up or whether she was just chosen by the king's. And it's interesting because as a Jew, the law would not have allowed her to marry the king because he's not a Jew. He's not a proselyte. He's not a convert. He's a lost man. And so the law would not have permitted that. And this would have been wrong for her to marry him. And also there's the other aspect that Mordecai and her are still here away from Jerusalem when they had an opportunity to return. And so the case could be made that they're even wrong to be here because they should have returned to Jerusalem. There could be a case made for that as well. And, for her to go, if Mordecai offered her up and said, oh, you go to be the queen, I mean, it's an environment which is it's pagan. I mean, these are pagan people. I mean, there's so many things here that you're like, this is not a good place for Esther to be. But one of the things we're going to see is that Esther is not just going to survive this environment. She's going to thrive because she's a wise woman. And this beauty contest that she's going to be entered into, she is going to win not just for her physical beauty, but for her wisdom. And so we talked a little about this. What is a woman's most beautiful aspect of her, physically speaking? And it's her
face.
Her face, her radiant face. And of course, the Bible talks about that. We won't go into that too deep. But her wisdom is also her beauty. Because we're going to see when Esther goes in to please the man who's in charge here, the Haggai. And God's going to give her favor in his eyes. But that's not because of just her physical beauty or her body was beautiful. It's because of her wisdom. In verse 9, read that for us.
And the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him, and he speedily gave her things for purification, with such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens which were meet to be given her, out of the king's house. And he preferred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women.
So he preferred her, and the idea there is that God magnified her in his eyes. So she's in a strange place in the palace, and of course you mentioned she's growing up there in the capital.
And Mordecai, who's a family member who raised her, has a position in the palace.
Yeah.
So there's going to be some familiarity, but she's not living in the palace. She's not from there.
Yeah. So this is interesting that Mordecai, and I'm assuming his wife, I don't think that there's a lot spoken about it. In verse 7 it says, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. So it doesn't really say a lot about the extra, but let's assume that Mordecai had a wife, and they raised her. And they raised a daughter who could go into the palace and gain favor in the eyes of the people in the palace. Because she's not just going to gain favor in the king's eyes. She's going to gain favor in the eyes of Haggai, the keeper of the women. And
it's very very interesting position she's in.
Yeah.
And her attitude is everything at this point.
Yeah.
It could be the difference between life and death, a miserable life and a happy life. Our attitudes determine that all the time, no matter what our circumstances are.
Yeah, and so, a woman says, how powerful is wisdom? And we see it here with Esther. I mean, she went into a situation, she's competing against the most beautiful girls in the entire kingdom. And this is the interesting thing. Women who are saved and wise have something that the world will never have. The world, they'll have their makeup and they'll have their clothing that's immodest and they'll have their, I'm going to use my body to get what I want, or my smooth words. Proverbs talks about the strange woman and her smooth words. But a wise woman has something that's so much more powerful than that, and that is her wisdom. And of course, not just her wisdom, but God is going to magnify her in their eyes because she's right with God. And we see that. You mentioned yesterday, Joseph. God did that with Joseph.
And she's kind of like our female, the women's version.
Yeah. The women.
Being in a position that you didn't ask for, that you never imagined.
Mm-hmm.
Not by choice,
yeah.
But still doing right and serving God.
Yeah, yeah. And so it says here that in verse 10, she had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she show it not. She was obedient to Mordecai. And they probably did that because, Mordecai didn't want it to be a strike against her, to be a Jew. But it was, you ask, was this wise? Was this right? And of course, they're hiding who they are. And so that's never right. To hide who you are. And we're going to see later that this wasn't a problem for the king. In fact, it's almost like the king was like, well, why didn't you tell me this? She's, oh, by the way, we're Jews. And, Haman, wants to kill the Jews. And so it's going to come up later on. She's going to show who she is. And it's not going to be a problem for the king. Yeah. So, I think the lesson there is you need to be bold. Don't be afraid of who you are, to show who you are, that you are a child of God. So in this chapter, we see, they probably shouldn't have been there. If Mordecai sent her in there to try and, to be the queen, then we see that the law was against that. And we see that she hid who she was. In spite of all that, God is still going to work and is going to use her.
On her behalf, she's just doing what she's told.
That's true. In either way, she's doing everything here. She's doing what she's told. She didn't have a choice in any of it.
She's obeying. She's doing what she's supposed to do.
Yeah, and God's blessing her.
So now the process of how the king is going to choose his queen. It's not what we would think of today.
Yeah.
But it says in verse 12, now when every maid's turn was come to go into King Ahasuerus, after that she had been 12 months, according to the manner of the women, for so were the days of their purifications accomplished, to wit, 6 months with the oil of myrrh, and 6 months with sweet odors and other things for the purifying of the women. Then thus came every maiden unto the king, whatsoever she desired was given her, to go with her out of the house of the women unto the king's house. In the evening she went, and on the morrow she returned into the second house of the women, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's chamberlain, which kept the concubines. She came in unto the king no more, except the king delighted in her, and that she were called by name. Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, was come to go in unto the king, she required nothing but what Hegai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed, and Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her.
That's incredible.
So this is really interesting because you've got to go through the process of the purification to prove that you really are a virgin and all of these things. But then when it's your turn to come before the king to try to gain favor, it's an all or none deal.
Yeah.
Either you're going to gain favor and become the queen, or you're going to become one of his concubines and only come before him if he calls for you.
Yeah.
And you get to choose how you present yourself to the king. You'll be given anything you want.
Yeah.
You can dress how you want. You can adorn yourself how you want. You can, whatever you want to take in to try to gain the king's favor. And here Esther, instead of just trying to figure it out on her own, she goes in with just what Haggai suggested.
Yeah.
She trusted Haggai to know what was best.
Yeah.
To go before the king with.
Yeah, and when she goes in, she goes and impresses him with her wisdom. I think a lot of the women, because, they weren't going to sleep with the king. It wasn't a go in and, sleep with the king to try and gain his favor. They had to gain his favor by their wisdom, by what they said. And, a lot of these girls, they go in and they're just empty and they're...
How they acted.
Yeah, maybe haughty and, all this stuff. But she goes in and she impressed the king. And obviously God blessed her. It says when she obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. That's God. That's God working in her. And, you're right. She only had one chance. If she messed up the first time, that's it. She can get to, think about this for a whole year. You're waiting to go into the king. You're thinking about this for a whole year. And the time finally comes and you're like nervous and you're like, oh, what if I mess up? But not Esther. Esther, you can imagine her as a confident, godly lady who's going to go in and trust in God to give her favor in the sight of the king.
And obviously, Haggai had to have some wisdom about him.
Yeah.
For the king to put him in charge of these women.
Yeah.
So it was very wise on her part to seek what do you think I should take in?
Yeah. And obviously people are like, well, this is a bad situation. Well, yeah, they're pagans. And she's going to be a queen to a pagan king. But God's going to use her. And you're right, she's just doing what she was told. She didn't have a choice to go back to Jerusalem. She didn't have a choice to go in. Whether Mordecai sent her in or whether they picked her, she didn't have a choice. And even about telling her, her people, that was what Mordecai had told her, not what she decided. And so she's going in and she's going to win this competition with her wisdom that God had given her, with her attitude. She has a right attitude. She has a right spirit. She goes in, and when she talks to the king, she's going to talk to the king, and she's going to win him over. Just with her words and with her conversation, and that's incredible. And I think it speaks a lot to Mordecai to be able to raise a young lady who can go into a situation like this. You think even Joseph, when Joseph went down to Potiphar's house, he gained favor in the eye of Potiphar, and that speaks a lot to his dad, raising him to be able to go in that situation. And Esther is the same way. And so, he did choose her in verse 16. So Esther was taken in unto the king Ahasuerus in his house royal in the 10th month, which is the month Theban, in the 7th year of his reign.
And this caught my attention. It was in the 7th year of his reign that Esther is chosen as queen. Mm-hmm. And when we look back in chapter 1, it was in the 3rd year of his kingdom that he had that Vashti lost her position as queen. So he was without a queen for 4 years.
Wow.
And we know that at least part of that time there were different women, there were women going through that purification process, because it was, for each person it was a year. Mm-hmm. And the Bible doesn't say what year he sent out. Yeah. Well, let's just assume it was 6 months to a year. That means there's a lot of women that have come before him and did not gain favor. Yeah. There's a lot of women still waiting to come before him. Yeah. And maybe those don't have to do either thing. Maybe they don't become because once Esther was chosen, maybe the others were released to go home instead of just become concubines. I don't know. Yeah. Bible doesn't say. It doesn't really matter in the story. Yeah. But 4 years was a long time for the king to be without a queen. Yeah, and you have to imagine he was comparing them all to Vashti, her beauty, and, going like, well, you're not Vashti. Yeah. And so, God did give her favor. And then, of course, he's... it says she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. It says too that earlier in the verse that he loved her above all the women. Yeah, he loved Esther above all the women. And there's a lesson here for ladies, when they're like, how do I influence my husband? How do I gain favor with him? And of course the answer is wisdom. Wisdom.
and being right with God. You know, if Esther can influence a king who you could make the case very easily that he was probably narcissistic. That's a common word today. He was a proud man. Obviously, you know, the feast he made. He's a lost man. And Esther, if she could influence not only the king, but the Bible says she obtained favor in all that looked upon her. You know, if Esther could do this, you know, in a lost kingdom, in a lost time, how much more, you know, today, a lady who's saved, a lady who has the Word of God, a lady who has the Holy Spirit abiding in her, how much more can she have that influence and that beauty that Esther had? Because there's nothing more beautiful than a wise woman. I mean, there really isn't. I mean, women who are fooled by the Hollywood and, you know, all today, it's all about physical beauty and all that. I mean, that's a lie. The most beautiful thing about a woman is her wisdom. And you can see it in a wise woman. And I don't know if women see that, but you can see the wisdom in a wise woman because it's in her countenance. And she has a wise countenance and a beautiful countenance. There's nothing more beautiful than a wise woman. He's going to make a feast for her. There in verse 18, he gave a state dinner and made a release to the province and gave gifts. So he gave them a tax break. So everybody's happy that the king has a king. The king has a queen. It's Esther. God gave her favor and chose her and made her queen.
Right.
And so at the end here, Mordecai discovers a plot to kill the king. And verse 22, and the thing was known to Mordecai and told it unto Esther the queen. And Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. And when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out. Therefore they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written a book of the Chronicles before the king. And Mordecai was not rewarded for this at this moment, but we know that it's going to come and play later in the book.
Right.
And so...
but it's interesting because Esther, we're seeing that Esther has that favor because the rule, you can't come before the king unless you're called.
Yeah.
But yet Esther had a way to communicate to the king in Mordecai's name. Oh, listen, Mordecai found out about this plot and was able to name it. So Esther, being queen, she has a direct line to the king above even others. Even when she has to wait to be called, she still has a way to send word to the king. Yeah,
that's true.
Communicate with the king.
Yeah. And so this is going to be an interesting study. We're going to go back to Proverbs for next week, Proverbs chapter 2. And so I really like the switching back and forth because you get stuff out of Proverbs and then you apply it to the ladies that we're studying. And so next week we'll be back in Proverbs chapter 2. And then we'll go back to Esther chapter number 3, where we'll be studying her life and pulling things out of her life to help encourage you to be the wise woman God wants you to be. And you can be a wise woman. And there's nothing more beautiful than a wise woman. And so, which we learned from Esther. Wonderful. Well, thank you for joining us, and we'd ask you to subscribe and like and share if it's been a blessing to you. Feel free to reach out to us and give us any feedback that you have, any comments or any feedback that you have for the podcast. Thank you for tuning in, and Lord bless you, and we'll be back, Lord willing, we'll be back maybe this week or next week with our next podcast. Thank you, and have a wonderful week.